Right, I could stand up here and talk a very long time about what we've just gone through, but let me try to just give you why I did or where it was. One, I'll just say that you guys, I see faces here that I've known since the first days of the Tea Party. And when I first ran, and there's new faces here. And you may remember the one promise I made when I first ran was that I would go to God every day on my knees and ask for His wisdom, His courage, and His strength to know and do His will. And folks, that's the only thing that's gotten me through this, because Austin is a treacherous swamp down there that destroys people. Amen. I see it happening to others, and that's the only thing that's held me together down there. Between that and Kay, watching every move I make and telling him when I didn't vote right. So, in this instance was one of those. And the thing that kept coming to my mind was there's never a right way to do the wrong thing. And we were faced with something that was hard to get it all separated into what would be the right thing to do. And I will tell you that one Bible verse that had the House followed, we would have never had this. And that's Proverbs 17:18. Amen. When the first man speaks, he is thought to be right until he is cross-examined. And that's what failed to happen in the House. The House had a mission to indict, to impeach. That's all they focused on, and they went and looked for salacious inputs, second, third, fourth hand. They didn't care, just so somebody would say something bad, and they would collect that up, and they call that evidence. They actually call that evidence third hand. And I was opposed when it came over. It was a surprise to me. I didn't know the House was doing this. I got caught by surprise. I did happen to was able to watch most of the hearing that day. I watched John Smithy when he opposed it in his eloquent speech. I watched Brian Harrison and listened to what he had to say. I listened to each one of them that talked there. We even had a Democrat that talked against it. And in very, very careful words, for the first time in the history of Texas, we had something that was compressed in just to a very short period of time, in which the witnesses, there were no true witnesses, but there was no testimony taken under oath. Not one person was under oath. No member of the House actually heard any testimony from anyone. Everything that was done was through hired lawyers. Most of them were Democrats, who went out and interviewed people looking for inputs of something bad to say about the Attorney General. And they would take it down and cook it for gospel. They called it evidence. If you heard what was said, if you heard when the whistleblowers got up there and talked, they talked about getting together and going to the FBI, and they were asked, what evidence did you take with you when you went to the FBI? You know what they said? None. We had none. They later tried to backpedal that and said, well, we had our testimony. That's evidence. No, they were true. That was 3 years ago. Had they gone with something at that time, do you think think about the FBI that went after the J6ers for just being in Washington. Do you think they would have sat on this for 3 years if they had something? Not in a heartbeat. They would have been there. We were told going into it, and I will tell you, I cannot say enough good about our Lieutenant Governor. Now, he and I have had our differences on things. We have not always agreed, and we worked it out. But I will tell you, he handled it. I cannot think of anything I would say he should have done differently or better than what he did in the way he handled it. It was even-handed. There was no thumb on the scales. I know of no instance in which he put any pressure on anybody to do anything in any direction. He worked extra hard to say, you've got to decide for yourself. It was him that said, okay, we have now been bombarded for several weeks with the media telling us all of this stuff that's been going on. So unlike a normal jury, we had our heads filled with guilty statements. No one in the media ever talked about the innocence of Paxton. All they ever talked about were the salacious stuff and wrapped it around having an affair. And most people say, well, anybody like that you need to get rid of. Well, I'm going to tell you what. If you want to get rid of the legislators that have had affairs, you're going to empty out 3/4 of the House and 1/3 of the Senate. They'll be gone tomorrow. Are those that, no, I'll forget that. Anyway, that's enough. So the point was made very strong. We were to go there, try to set aside what we had in our heads, listen to the testimony, and make a decision, understanding that the onus is on the prosecution to present evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a relatively high bar. Beyond a reasonable doubt, not a preponderance of the evidence, beyond a reasonable doubt. 20 articles. Some of them had 2, 3, 4 things he supposedly did wrong in them. And so the rules are that he has to have done all 3. If there are 3 in there, if they come up with evidence, absolutely hard evidence that he did 1 and 2, but nothing on 3, then that's an innocent. That doesn't get a vote. I didn't make these rules up. This is what comes with it. And they have to be specific to the way the articles are written. Well, one thing about it, the House moved so fast and so sloppy, they couldn't even write articles that made sense or were accurate.
Amen.
And it became clear. I'll just give you a couple examples. The one on the prosecutor pro tem. Why they added the pro tem, I don't know, but there was never anybody that said a word about Kaufman being hired as a prosecutor pro tem. Even the Travis County DA, who's a Democrat, had the opportunity to throw that in, and she didn't. It didn't match. It wasn't there. It didn't happen. They talked about him illegally hiring Kaufman. He's the AG. He is in charge. He is elected by the people, and he had all the authority in the world. I don't care what you say about it. Don't like it. It went out, but he did it because he had people that were refusing to do what he asked them to do. Now, you may not agree. Can you imagine you have a business, you run a business, and you've got employees that refuse to do what you want them to do? What are you going to do? You're going to move them or go around them or whatever, replace them. That's what he was doing. That came out so crystal clear in the testimony. Another one, bribery. Bribed. He had Nate Paul pay for their house renovations. So when he got to it, I'm expecting the prosecution, then he said, we got him nailed, because you got to remember the House, when they sent this over, they said, this looks bad, but you're going to find when you have the trial, it's 100, that was Phelan's word, it's 100 times worse than what we're even sending you. And so I'm waiting there for the prosecution to throw up a picture of a check signed by Nate Paul paying for this, or somebody that was related to him to saying this. You know what they had? He said, I got to call Nate. I got to call. That was all they presented when they asked about putting the countertops in. Was one of the people overheard the guy say, well, I need to call Nate. Well, when they put up the emails that kind of looked like, well, Nate was involved in it, it showed that this that the contractor had 3, 4, 5 jobs going at the same time that other people were involved in, and he was trying to juggle his time, and it very well could have been he was calling Nate to talk about the timing, could he be able to do it or not. My point was that was the only statement they didn't have. You know what did happen? The defense proved innocence by showing that the bills were actually paid. Right. Here were the bank. They showed the wire to the bank, going to the bank, the wire coming out of the bank, and the wire of the money going into the account. And then some people argued, well, that was right as they were blowing the whistle. He knew he was going to get caught, so he paid the bill. He paid the bill. That was what it was. He paid the bill. So what? In the thing. So I could go through all of them. They were all like that. And then the last four, if you weren't paying any attention to it, somebody must have said, we've got to get to 20. If we get 20, that'll be bad. So the last four would say something, he abused his office in at least one or more of the previous things we charged him of. And the next one would say, and he broke the law in doing something in one or more of the previous things. Went through the last four of them like that. It's like, come on.
Wow. That came from the House, right, Bob?
That's
the House.
That came from
not the Senate. The House.
No, that's what.
Right.
That is what came over to us.
Okay.
And the hearing in the House. I mean, it is the best word I can use in public is sham. It was a complete sham. It was obvious that there were outside influences that was pushing, you've got to have the impeachment. One of the, and I have one of the handwritten notes from one of the whistleblowers, when they were talking about what they were doing and so on, they got the handwritten notes. If you haven't seen it, it's got a big star beside it, X'd up, and he said, and it says, cook up bar charges against Wynn, Kamak, and Paxton. Cook up bar charges against these through, in his handwriting, one of the whistleblowers. That was the one that was written. And another one in the email said, here's what we need to do, and they had a list of about 5 things on there. One of them that never was followed through on was get George's number. What George, they never really identified it. There's a great deal of speculation that they knew who the George was. The next one was meet with Lewis. That was Lewis Sines, the governor's chief of staff. Never answered the question why they were coordinating what they were doing with the governor's staff. And the last one was drop the big bomb. And nobody really knows what that one was about in there. But the amount of what came from their emails, their handwriting, their testimony was amazing. If you didn't hear the testimony from the DA from Hays County, they said, they went down to, I don't know why they picked Hays County, but the DA, they said they took these things that they said he had done wrong and went down to talk to the guy was Greg something and said, what could he be charged with? And so he came up with this list of about 9 crimes that he could be charged with, just based on if somebody did these things, what could we charge him with? And so they put that up there as these items. And so Busby, I tell you what, if I ever need an attorney, I want to go get Busby. So Busby kept talking about it and says, that's really bad. Man, it is a reflection of just true corruption, isn't it? What you talk about, any office that would do those things, it has got to be corrupt. It's got to be doing illegal things. It must be organized crime. He went through and the guys said, yep, it is. Yep. And I said, you just couldn't get any worse than that, could you? And a guy like you could never work in a place like that, could you? He goes, no, I could work in there. He said, well, here's your employment application where you ask them for a job. And so that was just, but that was the desperation that they showed in the thing. But having said all of that, it put a real quandary. Well, let me finish the House side of it is, how in the world they ever concourse or whatever they did to get anybody to vote for something that was not a word was under oath. There was no meaningful testimony.
There were no House members involved in even hearing any testimony. Just a quick short report. They gave the members a memo about just a few pages of accusations about it, and then the word went out. The speaker expects you to vote for this, obviously. And we only had 23 courageous House members that said, hell no, I'm not going to vote for that.
And the rest were cowards.
Only 23. And some of them spoke very well, as I mentioned. And if you want to hear a really good talk explaining this, go back and pull up John Smithy. Go pull up Brian Harrison. And there are 2 or 3 others there that did it. But it comes over. When I looked at it, when it first came over, the thing that struck me, the first thing was the lack of process. No process had been followed. And those of you here that are related to law enforcement understand that the predicate to our laws is the proper process. It's what separates us from the third world banana countries, is our process. You know, if a law enforcement catches somebody, he catches them red-handed himself, robbing the liquor store, coming out with 2 bottles of bourbon under his arm and a handful of cash, and arrests him, takes him to jail, and he tells the judge, I was never read my Miranda rights. You know what's going to happen to that guy? He's gone. He's out. He's there. We do that.
Miranda rights only were read when you're asking questions.
We do that because we are very sensitive to not putting innocent people in jail. We have a basic philosophy. We'd rather let 7 bad people that did something go free than put 1 person who was innocent in jail. So we have a process for a reason. And that process was not followed. It was no process to it. And so I was opposed. I tried to talk the Lieutenant Governor into just throwing it back to him. And he said, we can't do it. He said, I basically said, I'd like to, but we're stuck. We have got to go forward with the trial. I said, we don't. No, we don't. I said, and he said, no, we do. So he won that argument, and we did. And he was right. We didn't have a process because it turned out the things I was hanging my hat on, they just ignored, and they did it. And some of the folks that know law better than I did said that the Constitution really only says 2 things. The House can impeach. The Senate holds the trial. And there are no other rules besides that. That's it. Even though we have law that said that House Investigation Committee was the only committee in the legislature that cannot waive or sworn testimony. It says it. It's right there. It's crystal clear. And the other section of the law that was recently written that says that anything done by a legislator prior to being elected cannot be a subject of an impeachment. I don't agree with that, but it's what the law says in there. Because the idea is an impeachment is not a criminal trial, it's not a civil trial, it's an impeachment. It's its own thing, even though the House kept saying, oh, but that's not what we do in a criminal trial, or that's not what we do in this, and tried to use it. But the point being, the people decided. The people knew, and most of what all they had him up there for, people knew he'd done. He knew he was having an affair. He knew that was all written about, and said people knew, and they still elected him. And so it doesn't count. I argued that would throw out everything, and therefore the process wasn't being followed. But that didn't stick either. So when it came up in the very beginning in there, I said on the print, many of my compatriots said, well, I just have to see the evidence. Well, we'll just look and see the evidence. And I kept saying, no, we need to stop this on process. But I didn't know how many were going to agree, so that first day, I voted for every one of the motions to dismiss, along with 5 others that voted. 6 of us voted for all of them, and there were a couple others that we had about 10 that voted at least once to dismiss. The 6 of us got called out in the Dallas Morning News as being the sleazy cowards for having voted for that. It was on the principle of it. And then so later, as we continued on through it, I will tell you, I would have to say it was very diligent of the senators. Many of them did not like Ken personally, never had liked him, never supported him, didn't like him, and we're actually trying to find a way to vote for him. There's no question in my mind about that. But as they went through it, and we sat there for all those days waiting and waiting and waiting for the prosecution to present evidence. And they had a good team. Their team had as good a credentials as did the defense. Their lead, Rusty, was involved in the Waco trial and was an outstanding attorney for that. He's got a great reputation. They had a good team there. The problem they had was they had no evidence. They had none. There was not one scintilla of evidence that was presented. And as they went through it, it was registering with the senators there. Now the Democrats had their minds made up. There was no way, because they were voting election. There was no question about that. And so that was a given. And going into it, what we needed, so you understand, it was considered the rules said it would take a 2/3 majority. That meant that it was going to take 20 votes to pass it, 21 votes, 21, and we excluded Angela Paxton. They voted to not allow her to vote in it. It had a plus and minus to it, but it's what it was. And back up, when they did the rules, I was one of 3 people that voted against the rules because of what they had set up. I thought should have them, so I voted against the 3 rules, against the rules. But I could not get to 10 people that I thought would vote to acquit. Because I was thinking, there's a strong feeling here. And then the night before, I got up to, I think maybe I could identify 12 that might vote 1 time or 2 times or so on, but I could not see it. And I was just saying, maybe we'll get there. Maybe we'll get there. That morning, we stayed late at night, going back over the evidence. I mean, the documents we had. People were digging, and then everybody was looking for something. And I finally quit and went home. And the next morning, when I went in, and we were going to meet at 9 o'clock, we decided. Everybody said, they asked the question, are you ready? Our deliberation was not like a normal jury deliberation. We didn't argue the issue. Strict rule was none of us could try to convince someone else how to vote. We could talk to them, we could tell them how we were going to vote, but we were not to have, it was not to be, you really ought to do this, Ben. I mean, this is the way you couldn't do that. And so the discussion as we went along, you get a feel for how people were going. And I went home that night and I said, we might get to 10. That was a lot of hopeful thinking. Next morning, Brian Birdwell, who I spent some time talking to, I was sitting near him on the floor, and he was there at his desk as he usually is. Nobody was around. I went up to him and I said, Brian, this is pretty heavy, isn't it? He said, I could tell. I mean, the weight on him, he was chair of the committee, and Brian he accepted that role just the way he should have. And he said, yeah, it is. And I said, Brian, we're going to meet, and all we're going to do is confirm that we're ready to vote, and we call Lieutenant Governor, and he tells the press, and a half hour later we're going to go out and vote. And I said, Brian, before we break up, let me pray for the group, if I could. And he said, okay. He said, just let me know. He said, if I forget to call on you, let me know. And I said, if I'm putting my hand up, Brian, that's what I mean. Because that was a joke between he and I, because he's kind of overlooked me a couple of times when I wanted to say something, and it wasn't by accident. So I said, okay. So we did. And I told the folks, I said, don't think anybody underestimates what we're about to do. But our founding fathers found themselves at the Continental Convention in a turmoil, and were about to come unglued. And Benjamin Franklin stood up and told them, a house that's built without God is a house built in vain. And he said, we need to bring God into this. And so I said, basically just prayed, God, bring our feelings and our hearts in line with the thoughts in our heads, that our mouths and hands will do what is right. And that's all I said. And we broke up and went out there. And when the first vote came down, the very first one, and we got to 10, because I had a score sheet for every one of them. I was taking the score. We got to 10. I thought, oh, that's good. And it kept growing, and it got to 16, and it was 16 to 14. I thought, oh man, this is good. But I know what this is. Everybody voted this one time, so they now can vote the other way. And then we did it the second time, and then the third time. And I said, oh, this may, but I still, with the way I didn't have any feeling. And when it was all over with, I mean, we had one that was 22.
Right.
22 on one of them. But the 16 to 14, because what I was really worried about was, if all we do is just barely stop this, 10 votes against and 20 votes for, that's a 2-1, yet he didn't get convicted. 20 people would have voted for him, but 10 people stopped it from happening. 2-1. I said, they will beat us to death in the media out there that we had it set up rigged, so that the small majority, or whatever they wanted to call us, sleazy cowards or whatever they would call, would have stopped it. And then it turned out that he was acquitted by a majority, by the most likely majority that we pass a significant number of bills, 16 to 14. And 2 of the senators that voted with the Democrats got exposed for who they really were. Yes. And I would not, as I thought later, I said, God, we could have had it 18 to 12. I said, thank you, God. You know better than I do, because that would not nearly has been as good as to get those guys exposed for who they were, and we still won. And God could not have orchestrated it, and it was in his hands any better than what he did. And I can tell you that the accusations of the Wall Street Journal of Dan Patrick putting his thumb on the scale is an outright lie. Absolutely.
He didn't call everybody doing like they said he did.
No, he did not. I can't tell you who he called or didn't. I can tell you the reactions of the people. There is nothing to support that. That is a loser, sour grapes kind of response to it. But I can tell you this, that we've got to make changes, and that's the conversation we've had. We have got to have legislation this next session that puts some guardrails on what the House does and what the Senate does. We can no longer go forward, and that was the quandary in which, okay, there's an awful lot of smoke here. There's got to be some fire, and I'm not going to say that Paxton is absolutely as innocent as a fresh-driven snow on stuff. I have no doubt that he has his style. He may have done some of this stuff. I don't know. It doesn't matter. But my trade-off in looking at the rationale here was the process was wrong, and we should have never gotten here. But now we are. And if we do convict him, the bigger picture really is what's going to happen to future legislations. What is going to happen? Yeah, we will have punished him, but it won't fix anything. And one of the things that came to my mind was trying to the decision the guy had to make on the sinking ship. The grandmother was there with her grandson, and there was only one life jacket left. And the grandmother was his wife, and it was his grandson. Who does he give the life jacket to? The grandmother's life would be over, it's done, it's been lived. The grandchild had a future to take care of. And that's the way I looked at it. The answer to fix this thing so that future legislatures don't have to go through that, if everything else was even, to me was the right decision to make, to take the greater good of the people, the process, and what happens in the future over maybe punishing someone, whether that might have been guilty. And all of that has nothing to do with, the merits of it or whatever it is. But I felt that was one of the big trade-offs to be made, and that's what really drove a lot of what the follow-up to the process was wrong. So that's kind of how it ended. I'll be glad to answer any questions, or if I wants to go home, that's okay too. But thank you guys.